Falcom is one of the most consistent studios out there. I've made no secret of my affinity for the Trails series on this channel, and it's one of my favorites in the genre. It's been going on for decades at this point and still never really had a bad game. That's still kind of true, but Trails through Daybreak 2 is the closest they've come. Coming off its fantastic predecessor and with the pedigree of the entire series, Daybreak 2 had a huge amount of potential. Unfortunately, the end result is a frustrating step back. Hello, my name is Ian Bits. If you haven't watched this channel before, I talk about video games. I do videos on here as well as on Noisy Pixel. I'll be trying to post on here at least once a month moving forward, so subscribe if you enjoy. This video might be a bit odd compared to my usual stuff. I think I arrived at the same sorts of conclusions as most people with this game, but I kind of went crazy trying to figure out why I disliked it as much as I did. So I have some stuff to say that might go against what others have posited. Let's get something out of the way first. You need to have the right expectations for this game, and part of the reason I didn't enjoy it is because of what I expected it to be. Thus far, the Trails series has operated on a setup payoff loop. The first game in an arc would be slower paced and focused mostly on setup, introducing the characters, setting, and teasing at the grander conflict. The following game would see that conflict be revealed and resolved along conclusions to character arcs that started in the first game. Outside of the epilogue titles, the series has been consistent with this formula, and the combination of many different threads converging at the same time has made games like SC and Azure some of the best RPGs I've ever played. Daybreak 2 does not do this, and for the most part it doesn't try to. The questions you had at the end of Daybreak 1 will remain almost entirely unanswered, and the Calvard story will not only continue in another game after this, but almost certainly a fourth to follow. This is far closer to a sort of side story fleshed out into a full game, and you should expect to end up more or less in the same spot as Daybreak 2 started. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Changing things up is fine, and there's more than one way to structure a story, even if it's odd to interject it in the middle of an arc. The issue is not necessarily the concept, but the execution, which is what this video is primarily going to be about. I should also mention before we start that there will be spoilers for and comparisons to Trails through Daybreak 1 throughout this video, as I'm assuming people watching through a review for the sequel will have played the first entry. Daybreak 2 is a direct sequel to Trails through Daybreak, taking place a few months after its conclusion and once again starring Van and his army of toddlers. Their search for the final Genesis finds a lead when a monster that looks suspiciously similar to Van's Grendel begins terrorizing Edith. After Van and Elaine track it down to a military base, they find themselves overpowered and they die. Don't worry, this isn't a spoiler, this is still the prologue. One of the Genesis devices activates and Van and Elaine come to their senses several hours prior, seemingly sent back in time. This time they do things differently and manage to survive, then start searching for answers on this mysterious Grendel in the final Genesis. Here we've already hit our first issue. I don't have the negative view towards time travel that I think a lot of people do. I understand the argument that it lowers the stakes, but I think if the game establishes this early on, it's entirely fine and could result in some interesting turns for a story to take. However, the issue with Daybreak 2 is that it only ever uses it to do one thing, with the characters dying and trying again. This wouldn't even be a deal breaker, except the game uses it to do this one thing over and over and over. I legitimately stopped counting, but I think it's something around 20 times. It's a waste of a premise and makes the game feel unnecessarily padded. This is sort of a common theme to the game, things that may not sound ideal but had paths to interesting uses that the game fails to find. After this opening section, the game follows a somewhat similar formula to Trails into Reverie for its first half, with each chapter split into two parties searching for clues regarding the Red Grendel in different places. After 2 chapters of this, the parties merge in an intermission chapter before Van takes control for chapter 3 onwards. Let's talk about the biggest issue with this game, which is the lack of anything new. And I want to head off a counter argument that I'm sure a lot of people have, that being that lack of newness is par for the course in Trails sequels. These games are often just effectively one extremely long game split into 2 parts, without much gameplay difference between the first game in an arc and its sequel. This is undeniable, and on paper Daybreak 2 doesn't seem like an outlier in this regard. But while games like SC and Trails to Azure didn't have many differences, by the time you'd gotten bored of the combat, the game was hurtling toward an insane and engrossing conclusion. With that missing, Daybreak 2 needed to do more. I don't know what the line is for a Trails sequel being too similar to its predecessor. All I know is that due to a multitude of factors, Daybreak 2 crosses it for me. The combat system is probably the prime example of this. There are a few new features here. The first is the ability to use arts in the action combat portions, which I never found to be particularly necessary, but it's a nice addition. Dodging enemy attacks in this mode will also allow you to do a quick swap now to another character and perform a charged attack, which adds a nice flow to these somewhat formulaic sections. In battle, you now have the option to do a combo attack on stunned enemies, which is a nice burst of damage to begin fights. But the most impactful positive change is just improved balance. You can no longer spam S-crafts due to a shift in their mechanics, and most crucially, the game isn't as insanely easy. It's still not a difficult game, but there are definitely spikes which will challenge you even on the normal difficulty, which is a welcome change from the first Daybreak, which I had to mod on my second playthrough just to get a bit of a challenge. These changes are all fine, but what they aren't is enough. Almost nothing else about the combat has shifted. It still functions in the same flow where you'll stun an enemy in field combat, then enter a turn-based battle where 9 times out of 10 you'll instantly vaporize them. In battles that last a bit longer, you have the same mechanics of setting up temporary boosts on your damage dealers to throw massive bursts of damage at an enemy, and listen, I just have so little to say about the combat. Since this video is aimed at people who've played the first, there's just nothing here to talk about. It's the same combat, same flow, the only major difference is that it's balanced better. So many new things that you take for granted in Trails sequels are absent here. Forget new S-crafts for returning party members, there are some characters that don't get any new crafts, period. The few new additions might have been enough to carry things in a traditional sequel or if the game's story was independently more engrossing, but neither of those things apply here. It plays things far too safe. The new system in Trails through Daybreak was good, it was enjoyable and shifted things up well from the back half of the Erebonia arc, but they needed to do more here to maintain the momentum if they wanted to commit to making this game deviate from the sequel formula. If you played Daybreak 1, you should know what to expect, and don't expect anything more. Even small changes like the ability to upgrade crafts feel token. The increases you get are so marginal and impossible to notice that it's barely worth mentioning. And in a change that seemed meant to highlight the lack of newness in the combat, perhaps the biggest addition to the entire game is a huge chunk of content that is basically just combat. The Marching Garden is the game's equivalent to the True Reverie Corridor, a series of randomly generated rooms with small objectives such as activating devices or taking out a certain number of enemies. Do this a few times and you'll face a boss, then you can take the currency you've gained to gain random rewards, which are comprised mostly of cosmetics. After each floor, you'll get the opportunity to grab a reward such as an accessory or quartz. However, this pulls from a pool of stuff that's already at your level, so the rewards never feel that substantial. The Marching Garden feels like padding, like the beginnings of an idea that was never fully realized. I just never felt like it added anything to the game. It felt like an obligation and added to the sense of repetition that the game was already struggling with. There also aren't any side stories here as there were in Phantasma and the Reverie Corridor. Let's circle back to why all of this stuff is highlighted. As I've said before, repetition, lack of innovation in combat, all this stuff is not abnormal for Trails sequels. And yet, as I said at the start, some of these games are still all-time favorites for me. The way the games build slowly upon character arcs over multiple games before finally paying off those arcs in a more fast-paced sequel is why I love this series. So many flaws in writing, gameplay, and pacing have been papered over by how well this has worked. Trails is not a series full of perfect games, but rather games in which the good parts are so good that you don't really care about the bad. This traditional sequel direction is one Daybreak 2 could have taken and doesn't. However, it isn't the only direction that could have brought success. My favorite game in the series is Trails in the Sky III, which is a largely self-contained side story that focused on a side character from previous titles, fleshing out his backstory and seeing him confront his past and grow. There were allusions to the future of the series, but they were only part of the equation. It's an example of how Trails doesn't necessarily need to tell its grand multi-game story to still have good writing. If it commits to an idea, it can execute that too. But Daybreak 2 avoids this path as well, finding itself straddling the fence between two ideas and failing at both. From the perspective of a traditional Trails sequel, it fails because it doesn't adequately resolve conflicts and character arcs from the first installment. The overall conflict with the Genesis is effectively put on hold, as the end of it is stretched out over an entire game when it didn't need to be. Van's origins and his whole demon thing are mostly ignored, and the only returning character from Daybreak 1 who sees major growth is Katra. Others such as Aaron and Fairy have some development certainly, but it amounts to another chapter of setup rather than the payoff we've come to expect. The one major exception to this is the intermission chapter, which is genuinely great and by far the best part of the game, but the rest doesn't follow. Instead, the most development goes to two characters from before the events of Daybreak, those being Swin and Nadia, which brings us to the other way in which this story could have worked, which is emulating Trails in the Sky III and committing to telling a somewhat self-contained side story with teases and allusions to the overall conflict rather than trying to address it. This is what the game seems to have been trying to do. Swin and Nadia are essentially the main characters here. The first few sections see the groups split up into one with Van and one with Swin and Nadia. They have by far the most emotional moments in the story, and they have their character arcs directly tied in with the events of the story, the conclusion, and the antagonists. This story revolves around them far more than it does around anyone in the Arkwright Solutions office, who, like the returning characters in Sky III, seem to be there primarily for somewhat unrelated character moments outside of the intermission chapter. And that's fine, that's honestly where the game is at its best. When it's not pretending to be about some grand plan, the individual character moments and world building are still top notch. The slow pace of the first act, solving minor problems in cities that flesh out Calvert and its people, these are great, but the game doesn't commit to this as much as it should have. It follows Van out of obligation for being a direct follow-up to Daybreak, not because he's the most important character in this story. He just doesn't have as much going on as Swin and Nadia here. The game is hurt by the fact that it's trying to be Trails Through Daybreak 2 and not like Trails Through Daybreak Gaiden or something. It pauses Van's story for unrelated character moments in a story around Swin and Nadia, which is completely fine, but it pretends that isn't what it's doing. All of this game's problems come to a head in its third chapter. If you're a degenerate like myself who tends to follow the reaction to these games before they make it stateside, Chapter 3 is probably something you've heard horror stories about. Despite all the negativity in this video so far, I genuinely want to stress that it's still something most Trails fans will enjoy up until Chapter 3, and will continue to enjoy after. But Chapter 3 is the absolute low point in the entire series. A mess of repetition, poorly fleshed out motivations, and padding that for the first time in series history made me question whether or not I would finish the game. It's the worst the writing in the series has ever been, and it attempts to sort of manufacture some sort of epic conclusion for the setup of the first act, but the only parts that succeed are, again, the parts with Swin and Nadia. It falters in the second half of the sequel, and compared to my previous examples of SC and Azure, that's the exact moment when everything should have been coming together. I won't go into more details to avoid spoilers, but Chapter 3 is really bad. I'm going to ask you to indulge me a second to end this video. I was irritated by this game, frustrated by how they followed up Daybreak so poorly when that game was possibly my favorite game in the series, and I was irritating myself trying to figure out why. So let me put forward my completely speculative theory on how this game was rushed. There are two pieces of evidence that I think support this. First is the length of the Calvert arc. As of right now, it is widely expected that there will be a fourth game, due to how the third game, Kai no Kiseki, ended. This was also likely not the plan from the start, as the epilogue for Daybreak 2, called Kuro no Kiseki in Japan, originally stated to be completed in Kuro no Kiseki Final Chapter. This strongly implies that the Calvert arc was originally meant to be 3 games long and was extended at some point mid-development, further supported by series president Toshiro Kondo implying after the completion of Cold Steel that he no longer wanted to do 4-game arcs, although in general you can't trust anything he says. The other piece of evidence is far more simple. Falcom has released a new entry in the East or Trail series every September since 2009, with the only exception being in 2015 with Tokyo Xanadu, a game of similar scope, taking that slot instead. They self-publish and make generally niche games, so this brisk release schedule and asset reuse are likely a big reason why they've managed to stay independent. Originally in 2022, that game was meant to be East 10 in honor of the series' 35th anniversary, but for whatever reason, it was delayed to 2023 with Daybreak 2 taking its place. This may have been because of Ys's new combat system or the new engine, or I could be completely off base and they just wanted Daybreak 2 to come out first. But I think this info, combined with how the Calvert arc has played out after this, indicates to me that at some point Daybreak 2 was moved up on the schedule to compensate for Ys needing to be moved back. With a tighter deadline, it makes sense that they wouldn't be able to do everything they wanted to do with a normal sequel, causing them to need a 4th game to truly do the arc justice. The lack of so many things you associate with sequels in the series. Things like new S-crafts or the ability to revisit cities from the previous game at will in the back half. These really stress to me that whatever ideas they originally had for a Trails Through Daybreak sequel were not the ones we got here. I could easily be wrong here, but the game feels so rushed that it was annoying the hell out of me trying to figure out why, and I think that at least gives it some perspective. Trails Through Daybreak 2 is an immense disappointment following its fantastic predecessor. It's not a bad game, but it's also a game that it's difficult to focus on the positives of. The negative aspects are so immediately apparent that they drown out the small steps forward. It's still got solid character writing and atmosphere in the first half. It's still got reasonably satisfying combat, and the new characters introduced in Daybreak still form an extremely likable cast. But the lack of anything new combined with a story that neither matches the standard you expect for a sequel, nor succeeds on its own merits, makes it tough for me to view this game as anything but a disappointment. Daybreak 2 is my least favorite game in the series so far. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, consider subscribing and leaving a comment. It helps it not get lost in the YouTube algorithm. Consider checking out my work on Noisy Pixel, which I'll link in the description. There will also be a video on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth going up there at the end of the month.